Welcome back. I'm going to talk now about science, Christianity, colonialism, and missionaries. And what I'll be saying will follow closely from this reading, the chapter Missionary Science by John Stenhouse. And this is taken from the Cambridge History of Science. And so I encourage you to read that closely. One of the lessons here is hopefully that there's things we can learn from history, but also that context is very important. And this context will influence apologetic strategies, but also how effective they may be or may not be. So first I'll talk about William Carey, who's a missionary, botanist and science educator. Then Alexander Duff, who had the view that science could be used as a weapon for mission. One of the points here is that the gospel, science and Western culture are not the same, and that in India and South Asia, the science apologetic approach used by the first missionaries usually failed and sometimes even backfired. So let's go to William Carey. I'm sure many of you know of him and his incredible influence as one of the first British missionaries in India. And so in 1792, Carey wrote an influential book called Inquiry into the Obligations of Christians to use means for the conversion of heathens. And some ways Carey is often considered, not necessarily correctly, to be one of the founders of the modern European missionary movement. Now, the book is interesting because, perhaps not commonly appreciated, he urged readers to imitate the universal benevolence and general philanthropy of God himself by spreading useful knowledge with the gospel. So Carey himself lived this out. He was an avid gardener and also a self-taught botanist, and his passion for botany and the botany of the South Asia, including publishing a number of definitive scientific treatises. And but this was not his motivation. Was also to use the knowledge he had of botany to help prevent future famines in India. And so he introduced various techniques of Western agriculture. So, but Carey was perspective and approach was not universally appreciated. An American evangelical threatened to withhold money unless Carey focused solely on theological training, not science. Carey replied, quote, "I've never heard of anything more illiberal. Pray, can youth be trained up for the Christian ministry without science? Do you in America train youth for it without any knowledge of science?" The next person that's very important is Alexander Duff. You may have heard of him because he was very influential in shaping the Indian education system, and particularly the reason we're taking this class in English is arguably because of Duff. He was the first Scottish Presbyterian missionary to India, beginning work in 1829, and he founded the Free Church College in Calcutta, and which became a model for missionary education. Now, it's important there that all instruction was in English, but students didn't only learn the Bible, but they learnt Western science. And Duff successfully advocated to the British colonial government that English should be the primary medium of instruction in all schools. It's important to understand where Duff was coming from and what his underlying attitude was to the local concept, the local culture. He had a very low opinion of Eastern languages, of Bengali, Sanskrit, Arabic, and also of Eastern literature and culture. This is illustrated in the following. Lord Auckland, who was Governor-General of India, had sought a balance in education between Eastern and Western approaches and in the content. Now, Duff responded publicly as follows. He said, "Your Lordship proposes to unite the living with the dead, to revive the spirit of the Dark Ages and mix it with the spirit of modern enlightenment, to divide the empire of education equally between the devotees of antiquated error and the propagators of acknowledged truth." And so clearly he saw Western culture and language as vastly superior, and that was some of his motivation, which was rather unfortunate. So Duff urged missionary teachers to force the sacred books of the Hindus into head-on collision with the truths of astronomy, chemistry, medicine, geography, and all the facts of modern science. And he thought that by using science to discredit traditional cosmologies rooted in Hindu sacred text, Duff and his colleagues hoped to smash, quote, the towering superstitions and idolatries of the East. And then young Indians liberated by science would be free to embrace Christianity. However, they were not successful. One historian notes that Duff underestimated the resilience of Hinduism and its ability to adapt itself to Western knowledge without being undermined. And so Hindu students accepted Western science but remained Hindu. Nevertheless, some science continued to be seen as a weapon for mission. Some missionaries almost idolized science as a God-given weapon with which to debunk heathen superstition and clear the way for the gospel. Stenhouse notes that well into the 20th century, many missionary physicians and doctors believed that spreading rational scientific medicine would supplant indigenous healing practices they considered superstitious and harmful, and this would prepare the way for the gospel. And like it or not, missionary enthusiasm for science as intellectual napalm helped carry it around the world. In a more balanced approach was where science was seen more as a sweetener in mission. And so, example is Daniel Poor, an American missionary in Ceylon, and he had observed that discussing Christian doctrine with learned Brahmins often broke down an argument. And so he shifted to a common interest in astronomy. And when a local Brahmin predicted a lunar eclipse, Poor set up a telescope in front of Bhattakota Seminary and invited the public to see that the eclipse occurred when he, not his Hindu rivals, predicted. And science did feature prominently in the curriculum of the seminary later, but it eventually closed because of the limited number of conversions. But later alumni reopened it as Jaffna College. So there are positive examples of people using science in mission. And so often indigenous Christians reconfigured new Western knowledge in linguistic and cultural forms more appealing to local sensibilities, becoming scientific missionaries to their own people. Example of this was Shastri, a Tamil Christian, who translated Western missionary science into a Tamil Christian framework using the literary form of the Kuravanji, a popular traditional musical dance drama designed to appeal to diverse audiences. And so his Bethlehem Kuravanji deployed Copernican astronomy to challenge traditional geocentric astronomies based on Hindu sacred texts. Another positive example was Ramchandra, who was a mathematician, social commentator, and Christian convert in Delhi. And he admired European inventions, seeing them as miracles, and he published books in Urdu popularizing Western science and, more controversially, criticizing Hinduism and Islam. But science was co-opted by Hindus, and locals often embraced the new learning to strengthen their own family, community, caste, nation, and religion. So, intrigued by European science brought by Lutheran missionaries, King Savoji of Tanjore was a modernizing Hindu, and he created his own biological collections and a zoological garden with a library containing the latest European science and medicine. Raja Ramahan Roy in early 19th century Bengal, he was friendly with Duff and other missionaries and urged the British to promote science education. And Roy incorporated Western science into his movement to modernize Hinduism and strengthen India. But the mission strategy often backfired because some turned the new science against the missionaries, the West, and Christianity. Chatterjee, who is memorialized in an Indian stamp, argued that the enormous time scale and sophisticated metaphysics of Hinduism showed it was a more rational, scientific, and progressive religion than Islam or Christianity. And so what we see is some significant flexibility on the behalf of Hindus, adaptability. And it's interesting that in more modern context, this has been noted. So Pavan Varma was a distinguished Indian diplomat and writer, and in this book, Being Indian, he says the following after contemplating how Hindus are quite comfortable with modern science and with ancient rituals that some would consider unscientific. He says the mistake one should never make is to accept the amiable Indian as a monolith. He is a most well-adjusted, split personality, capable of living simultaneously and effortlessly on two mutually opposed planes. He can take a quantum leap from one epoch, one period of time to another without showing any strain. His mind is like a chest of drawers, never a single cupboard. Each drawer can be a world unto itself and can be pulled out without reference to the others in response to a given situation. So he considered that there was a lot of compartmentalization of thinking. So are there some lessons from today? Well, I think it's important we don't confuse Christianity, science, and Western culture. They're three different things. There may be some influence of each on the other, but they're not the same thing. And also, particularly for apologetics, it's important to appreciate that rational arguments have limited value in some cultural contexts. And we should share the gospel with humility and not superiority. One language or culture doesn't take priority over another. And so a better apologetic may be to use science to illustrate the wonders of God's creation and to raise question. And also science and education and mission should be part of mission as acts of love, not as a means for evangelism. And we should acknowledge that colonialism was intertwined with Western missionary activity and the spread of modern science. And consequently, post-colonialism understandably feeds anti-Christian sentiment and Hindu nationalism. We should acknowledge the sins and injustices of colonialism, the mistakes of missionaries, and show empathy to those who criticize them. And we should help people not to conflate colonialism, the mistakes of Western missionaries, the gospel, Western culture, and science. And we should find ways to affirm what is good about indigenous culture, and language, and knowledge systems. So I hope that's shown you just a brief historical survey of just how important context can be and how there's some significant lessons we can learn from history.